Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining me tonight as we begin a new series, a mini-series on what in some ways is a very difficult topic, that of loss, but also, nothing more relevant than the topic of loss, because sadly, it's part of life. It's part of life, and unsurprisingly, it therefore appears all over the place in the Torah and in Jewish tradition, because it's as the saying goes, right? Death and taxes. It's simply part of life, and I decided to put this series together during the lead up to the 7th of Adar, which is next month, where Jewish tradition believes that is the date of the death of Moses. And I thought, okay, so this would be kind of a good time for us to reflect a little bit on this subject. And the way that I'd like to do this, there's obviously so many different things we can talk about. But what I've decided to do is to look at different episodes in the Torah that essentially center around episodes of loss, and to look at what would almost seem perhaps strange comments or kind of descriptions of those moments that at first glance we possibly simply just kind of pass through during the reading or don't give much thought to. But actually, if we look at them, there's actually a lot for us to think about. And I think that ultimately these episodes that we're going to study over these weeks will hopefully be a springboard for us collectively and as kind of individually to think about the complexity of loss in a way that goes beyond the simplistic way that we often think about of somebody dies, we miss them, but to actually appreciate the implications and reverberations that those tragedies, as it were, or even if they're not tragic, but tragic to people who experience them, the impression that they leave. And I would certainly say that these topics lend themselves to a degree of conversation. And, as a result, I would say absolutely, if kind of during these studies, if there is something that anyone would like to share, whether from, their own personal experience, please feel welcome to do so. I think that this is a class, but actually I'd like to also, welcome the fact that this can also be a space within which we can kind of share and process what we might be feeling personally around some of these topics. And some of these areas of loss may be relevant to some of us and not to others, and some yes, some no, and that's okay. That's okay. The part of the idea is for us to learn, and even if somebody hasn't experienced something themselves, we're all human. We all can, imagine what an experience is like, and sadly, many of these kinds of things are things that all of us, sadly, at some point in our life will experience. And so what I'd really like to do is to kind of zero in on some episodes that I think in some way, or aspects of stories that don't usually get a lot of attention, either because they find themselves in parshiot that maybe have other things going on that end up getting more attention, or because the subject matter is the kind of thing that we don't speak about publicly so much because it's not comfortable. But actually, there's a lot there to unpack that make it, even just from like a intellectual learning standpoint, I think a really rich study. And this first class, I think, absolutely really kind of gets into some really intriguing verses in the Torah that I think, whether you've noticed them before or whether you've given them much thought, I suspect that as we go through them, there may be this kind of, that's interesting. What do I make of that? Or, what is that saying? What is that saying to us? And of course, that's all predicated on the notion that the Torah is telling us something. We don't presume that it's just kind of a throwaway line. There's lots of things that happen in people's lives that the Torah doesn't tell us. It's not like a play-by-play of everything that happens. If it's telling us something, it's because it's significant in some way. And I think that in that sense, there really is something for us to think about and to grapple with within these episodes. And so this first class, we're going to be thinking about the loss of parents. Okay. Now, part of that may be the experience of losing a parent and how troubling that is, but also kind of the question of like, what are the reverberations of a loss of a parent? And how does that impact family dynamics? So that's something that I think we can kind of get into with this. And what I would say is a lot of stuff we're going to talk about are kind of what I would say are like beyond the halakha, meaning in the halachic language, we talk about, the laws of mourning, and this is how you do it. These are the things that you don't do during mourning. And it's meant to reflect, shall we say, almost like the emotional state that a person is in or should be in when experiencing loss. But obviously the halakha doesn't dictate the implications for family dynamics, right? But obviously, but those things are real. So, the Torah has a lot to say that goes, in addition to halachic things, the Torah has a lot to say in terms of lessons and perhaps advice or things that we should be aware of as we experience the trials and travails of life. And so we're going to study some episodes that deal with the loss of parents. And yet on some level, the episodes are going to focus more on the children, right? So it's not on the parent, but ultimately we're going to be looking at kind of how is the loss of the parent impact on the survivors, in the sense the children. And in other ones, we'll look at spouses and perhaps when parents lose children. We'll look at different kinds of dynamics. But tonight's class will look at the loss of a parent and obviously the impact it has on children. So we're going to start with the episode of the death of Avraham. And what the Torah tells us about what happens when he died. So I'll kind of scroll down as we look at some of these sources. So this is from Genesis 25. And would somebody like to read what it says there in the English? Eve,
okay, if you want.
Yeah, great. Yeah.
Okay. Just a minute. Okay. This was the total span of Abraham's life, 175 years. And Abraham breathed his last, dying at a good ripe age, old and contented, and he was gathered to his kin. His sons, Isaac and Ishmael, buried him in the cave of Machpelah, in the field of Ephron, son of Zohar the Hittite, facing Mamre, the field that Abraham had bought from the Hittites. There Abraham was buried, and Sarah his wife. After the death of Abraham, God blessed his son Isaac, and Isaac settled near Be'er Laharoi.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you.
In the Hebrew, do you want me to read?
No. Well, we'll start. I've included the Hebrew for all the sources. I figure we'll read them in English so that everyone can understand most easily. But perhaps, depending on what the episode says, perhaps we will at times look at the Hebrew for clarification, because the original obviously is always more accurate. So this story talks about the death of Avraham and talks about his burial, and it mentions that who buries him? Yitzchak, as you would expect, and also Ishmael, who's also his son. And the commentaries pick up, obviously, on the fact that Ishmael is present and are, to a certain degree, surprised. Now, why would they be surprised? Anybody have any thoughts? Why would we be surprised potentially at Ishmael's appearance?
Well, because he was banished so many years ago, but in fact,
didn't he come back at some point before he died, though?
yes, that's what I thought.
So fine. So that's the question, right? Meaning, we know that Ishmael was banished with his mother Hagar when he was a child, right? So you're talking about many years prior that had taken place, and yet all of a sudden we find Ishmael, here burying Avraham. So there's a couple things here which are, shall we say, noteworthy. One is simply Ishmael's appearance, and the second one is not just his appearance, but is the impression that you get from reading this verse that it's something that Yitzchak and Ishmael do together, right? So in a sense that they are working together, like you would expect brothers would, right, at the death of a parent. And so that kind of lends itself to almost the sense of, is there a relationship here? What's going on, within this dynamic of these half brothers who seemingly have been separated for, decades, but now not separated, and they're there together. And so the question is this a one-off? Is there a lasting ripple? Do Ishmael and Yitzchak, go on family picnics afterwards, and have a relationship going forward? Like, what is happening within this dynamic? And the truth, and we'll see that there are commentaries on this, but I think we could imagine a number of different scenarios, right, about what happens within the dynamic between Yitzchak and Ishmael, right? On one hand, you could imagine that, they each have a sense of relationship to their father. So they both show up at his funeral, and then that's it. Or you could imagine they're one happy family, and they're doing this together. So I think we'll take a look at that and think about that. Does anybody have any kind of initial thoughts before we move on to another episode where we'll see something similar?
Well, there isn't a blessing from God to Ishmael. There's only one to Isaac. Right.
So that's definitely true, right? Because that's part of this notion, right, that the covenant of Avraham passes through Yitzchak, right? It doesn't pass through Ishmael. We know that Ishmael also receives blessings, even in that original episode where he's banished. Already there, the angel gives blessings and so forth. But correct, the ultimate Brit Avraham, that will go just to one of the children, right? That will go to Yitzchak. But that issue is that you pointed is something for us to think about too, because obviously that's significant and will be significant in some of the other stories that we'll also look at. Yeah, does anyone have any other thoughts on this? Okay, fine. I want people to chime in. So I really am encouraging people to, shall we say, spitball and kind of think through, because that's what's so interesting about these episodes. And the truth is that on the things that we're looking at, there actually isn't a lot of traditional commentary on them. In preparation for the class, I obviously studied the traditional Miforshim, and they don't talk about this stuff much. There's a little thing here and there. And so I think these aren't the kinds of things that the Miforshim were necessarily thinking about. And so as a result, they don't necessarily address some of these things like family dynamics. There's a lot for us to kind of think, to unpack, and not to maybe do the lazy thing of just reading what the Miforshim say and kind of being like, oh, that's what they say, so that's what it is. But actually really is on us to sit here and just say, let's, darshani, like interpret what's occurring in these stories. Is there something that's going on there? Yeah, Eve.
Well, you think that Ishmael would be angry that he was sent away, and that he had to grow up separately. And how would they might have reacted to each other for that reason?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, forget the dynamic between Yitzchak and Ishmael. Like, even from Ishmael's perspective, this person banished, him and his mother when he was a child. You would think there'd be quite a lot of resentment. Now, did he know that it wasn't Avraham's wish to do that, right? That it was at Sarah's instigation that happened, and that maybe Avraham really always did have affection? And it's a good question. I don't know, meaning those are the kinds of things we need to be thinking about. Sometimes there may be indications in the verse, sometimes there aren't. Sometimes the Midrash has interesting things to say, sometimes it doesn't. So, but those are exactly the kinds of things I want us to be thinking about, because these stories are rich, they're complex, they don't always appear in a linear way. You have one thing that happens in that parasha, nothing another parasha, nothing another parasha, and you actually have to kind of string them all together. So I didn't do that. I didn't bring the entire story of Ishmael and everything throughout this. I'm partly assuming that people have some degree of familiarity with that. But if we mention anything, or someone mentions an episode that someone's not familiar with, just say, and I'm happy to kind of fill in the gaps. But that's something that's a great point, because I think those are the kinds of things we need to be thinking about, and why kind of Ishmael's appearance, for multiple reasons, seems surprising, shall we say. Good. Anybody have any other thoughts before we go on? Okay, so let's look at another story. It's the next one in the line, right? Now the death of Yutzkoch. Yitzchak also had two children with complicated relationship, right? That of Yaakov and Esau. And let's see what it says over here. Would someone like to read source number 2? Yes. Someone?
Yeah, I've got it. Hang on.
Great. Thank you, Paul. Okay.
And Jacob came to his father Isaac at Mamre, at Kilorath, now Hebron, where Abraham and Isaac had sojourned. Isaac was 180 years old when he breathed his last and died. Isaac was gathered to his kin in ripe old age, and was buried by his sons Esau and Jacob.
Wonderful, thank you, Paul. So once again, we have the death of a patriarch, and we have the fact that both of his sons appear to bury him. Now again, should we or shouldn't we make anything of this? Should we read into this? Once again, Esau certainly would have reason to be frustrated with his father, right? His father gave the blessing to Yaakov. It seems that maybe he was tricked into it, possibly. We know that Esau was beloved by his father, right? We're told that at the very beginning of his life, that it says that Yitzchak loved Esau. And so in that sense, maybe here it's less surprising that Esau would be there, though on the other hand, I don't know, you could also understand that Esau could be upset. And then obviously there's the question of the relationship between Esau and Yaakov.
And again, they'd been separated for many years and they got together again.
Right.
Met up again.
And here we know they got together again, right? Because the Torah
Yes.
tells us that when Yaakov came back, right, from the house of Laban,
He met
I
it.
got stuck on a call.
right, that they had this whole re-encounter that takes place with the gifts and embracing one another and so forth. It's actually a strange embrace. I'm trying to think if I bring it over here. Yeah. Later, we'll take a look at it later on. I brought it the source later, kind of what happens in that encounter. But again, once again, is this verse implying that they kind of do it together, and therefore there is this relationship between the siblings? Are they just being dutiful sons and doing what's right for their father? What's going on over here? But the Torah is like making a point, again, that like both his children were there. Both his children buried him. And I don't think it's something that we should just kind of gloss over, especially for the fact that you then also have it with Ishmael and Yitzchak doing it with Avraham. There definitely seems to be this, shall we say, theme or repetition occurring within these stories of the loss of the patriarchs. I'll mention that one of the things commentaries do try to understand is what is the significance of dying in ripe old age, which you find by both Avraham and Yitzchak, and the commentaries deal with that in different ways. But one of the ways that it's dealt with is this idea that their children repent. So by the time they die, they die in like all my kids are good. They're like the biggest fear of parents. The child goes off and lives a bad life, so he died in old age. That good. His kids turned out okay in the end. That's one approach to it. So there is this kind of like relationship going on in the way these things are interpreted, to say that like the fact that these children are present is an indication that they are good, that they are righteous, almost, if you could go that far. But what does that mean in terms of the relationship between the brothers? That's something else that I think we need to, we should think about. We may not have answers, but maybe something for us to think about. Does anybody have anything they're thinking about within the story of Yaakov and Esau? Okay, so let's go on to the next story, because the next story is a bit heart-wrenching, I would actually say. Would someone like to read source 3? This is from the very end of Bereshit.
Hey, I can read this one.
Great, thanks, David.
Not drop my video on. Okay. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph still bears a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrong that we did him?" So they sent this message to Joseph. "Before his death, your father left this instruction. So shall you say to Joseph, 'Forgive, I urge you, the offense and guilt of your brothers who treated you so harshly. Therefore, please forgive the offense of the servants of the God of your father.' And Joseph was in tears as they spoke to him."
Okay, thank you, David. So David, here we have a description of the events after the death of Yaakov. So what's the question here to add? There's a few questions on this.
Well, Joseph is obviously much more senior than the brothers.
Yeah.
And is in a more senior position, and so they're clearly the brothers are nervous of the reaction.
Yes. Yeah. That seems for sure. So what's the question on this this?
One of the questions would be, what's the overriding principle why they should have Joseph there? Because if you look at the other two texts, it's saying it's just default that the two brothers turn up together and carry out equal duty to bury, albeit with their past and the history. But here, again, Joseph would turn up. There wouldn't be a problem to carry out the burial with his other brothers in equality. But they're fearful of their past relationship and any retribution that could occur. So the overriding principle here is that all the brothers should be present at a burial.
Well, that's it. This is that they've already buried Yaakov. They've gone to Israel, Canaan. They've buried him. They're now back in Egypt, and then this episode occurs. So, does anyone have any questions on this? Because maybe we'll just read it one more time because there's actually quite a lot of questions on this, right? So so maybe I should have introduced the story, but right, Yaakov, they've all moved to Egypt.
Yeah.
Yaakov dies. They go back to Canaan to bury him, and they'll go back to Egypt. They get back to Egypt, and then it says the brothers saw that their father was dead. Right? There's a discussion in the commentaries. What does it mean? They saw that he was dead. We can think about that. And it says they said, "What if Joseph still bears a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrong that we did to him?" Right? Understandably, Yosef might be quite upset. And so they sent him a message, and they said that before our father died, he left these instructions that you should forgive us. Right? And
it's not necessarily. In fact, they don't really know whether Yaakov, whether Yaakov did. They just think that the brothers made it up so that they could try to get Joseph to forgive them.
Who's they think? Sorry.
The brothers, sorry.
So say that again.
The fact that they say that their father gave him an instruction to say to Joseph is thought that it wasn't the case, but they made it up so that they would try to ask for his forgiveness and not be that he wouldn't resent them all the time and punish them.
Right. So that's very good. So the first question about this is, were they lying? Right? They say, this is what dad told us to tell you. So the first question is that true? Did Yaakov say this to them? Or are they simply saying this because they're afraid? That's question number one. There's another question which goes like a little bit deeper about what this exchange implies. Anybody have any other things that this like making them like be like, I never thought through the whole story, because it actually makes you kind of question, what's gone on for the past 20 years. Anybody have any thoughts on this?
Well, Joseph was actually so happy to see them that he treated them well.
Yeah.
But he must have resented the fact, or he believed that God sent him anyway.
Right.
So he was very emotional about it, and he was sad about his father.
Yeah. But think about the sweep of the story, because the whole story with Joseph and brothers is that Joseph is sold into slavery. Okay. And they go to their father and they say that Yaakov was killed by a wild animal.
Joseph.
Yeah, Joseph was killed. Lo and behold, years later, Joseph turns out to be alive. So the question is did Yaakov ever know what actually happened?
Good question.
Did Yaakov ever say to the brothers, where did you find his coat? You know, did he ever go to Joseph and say, Joseph, you're alive. How'd you end up in Egypt? I have to know the story. Did Yaakov know?
Maybe it's better sometimes not to ask questions.
Well, that's the question, right? Did Yaakov not ask? Right? Meaning so let me ask you, does the fact that the brothers say this to Joseph imply to you that Yaakov knew or didn't know?
Yes.
So you say yes, Mom. Why do you say yes?
Because of how they're phrasing it. Why would the father have given them instructions, to tell them, oh yes, Yosef, should definitely forgive you? I mean, what would there be to forgive if he thought, I don't know, just somehow miraculously he ended up
right. Yes, very good. Right. So the flow of the narrative implies that presumably Yaakov did know. Now we don't, if that's true, we don't know who told him, right? And whether what Yaakov would have presumed or not presumed, what this would have meant about the relationship. So there's a lot of questions here. Did Yaakov know or Yaakov not know? If he knew, who told him? And did he or didn't he tell the brothers to instruct Yosef to forgive them? The Torah doesn't tell us the answer to any of these questions, and you find different things among the Mefarshim on different sides of this as they try to peel this apart, right? But again, and we'll look at what Ramban says in a little bit. But again, you find in the story again this kind of like aftermath after the death of a parent. A parent dies, siblings get together, and what happens? Is there reconciliation? Is there fraying at the edges? Do old fights finally break open? Is there actually, let's all get back together again? You feel that tension, that perhaps, while, the father was alive, maybe some of these issues were kind of on the back burner, and now that he's not. In fact, one of the some of the commentaries say, the verse had said the brothers saw that their father was dead. So they say, what do you mean they saw? What do you mean they saw that he was dead? First of all, this is after he was buried. They've already come back. So it doesn't mean they saw that he was dead. So some of the commentaries say, what would they see? They apparently, as again, the Midrash says, they would all dine together when Yaakov was alive. And it says when they got back to Egypt, Joseph didn't invite them for dinner. So they said, oh, that's it. They saw that actually maybe something was going on. Now, then the question is was that intentional? And some people say, maybe it wasn't intentional. He did it as a sign of respect to the brothers. Because normally when Yaakov was there, Yaakov would sit at the head of the table. But now that Yaakov wasn't there, who would sit at the head of the table? Would it be the elder brothers or not? Should it be Joseph? And so he just kind of didn't invite them. Who knows? But the point is according to that, the brothers really were afraid. They thought maybe the only reason that Yosef, played nice was because Yaakov was around. Now Yaakov was around, he wasn't going to, which again would imply that maybe they made up then this directive of their father. We'll look at what Ramban says. But again, I think what all these stories kind of bring out that we have to be thinking about is what happens when a parent dies.
I think also people mourn in different ways. Some people it's deeper. Some people have things that they're concerned about after that their parents did or didn't do for them. And this obviously is all connected. It's all linked up because of what happened and how they treated their father badly, that they told him that Joseph was dead and treated Joseph badly. And the whole thing is that then they've got to work their mourning through, and it might be more complicated because of the whole situation that happened over the years, in those years.
Absolutely. And I think that that's true, right? Because when we think about family dynamics, there's like the dynamic when the parent is alive. There's the dynamic around what to do at the time of death. And then there's the dynamic afterwards down the road, right? And all of these stories are kind of like indicating these different complicated moments. And, anyone who, has seen family dynamics around the death of a parent, know that all of these things happen. As a rabbi, you see it all, but anybody, any of their families, everyone sees all these things playing out, about how siblings deal with these kinds of issues and what happens with the burial and sometimes fights that happen and afterwards. And these are like emotionally intense moments, and there's a lot that kind of can get packed into these things. And ultimately that can create lots of tension. That can be moments of great positivity. I think with anything in life is that like people can come out of difficult situations. People can deal with difficult situations well, and people can deal with difficult situations badly. And the difference is probably whether people are being intentional in those moments or not. Sometimes out of your hand, because you might have a good intention, someone else doesn't, then it doesn't work. But the point is that like sometimes life happens to us, and sometimes we can kind of be a bit proactive on how we deal with life. And that's something that's good to think about within these stories, is obviously ultimately within our own lives, how we engage with some of these difficulties. So
but you do get the impression that Joseph, the fact that he showed emotion when the brothers spoke to him, gives you the impression that he was rising above the situation and not getting into an argument about who said what to whom at what point with regard to the father, but he was basically emotional that they had said this to him, and he was effectively showing leadership.
So, but what's the emotion? What's he crying
Well,
about?
by having tears.
But I'm saying, what are his fears? Why is he
accepting it and walking away, or just not accepting what they said? He could have got into an argument at that point.
But do you think he's crying? Do you think he's crying because he feels that, like, in essence, they are asking for forgiveness?
Effectively.
Is he crying because he can see they're afraid?
Exactly.
I don't know. I mean, I think there could be some slightly different variation.
Yeah, no, there could be. I think he's emotional because of the fact, clearly his father's died, but he's emotional because of the fact that they are accepting the guilt. But he already felt that when Reuben spoke to him when they returned to Egypt, when the father was alive, before the father had died. So this is the second time effectively we're having this.
Yeah. It's a very charged interaction. I would for sure. It's very emotional, and that's what I love about these stories, because these are real people. These are like real moments. And they're experiencing life the way that everyone deals with life, and you can really kind of, if you think about those things and you let yourself get into it, you can really, I think we often kind of get caught in the big sweep of, the forefathers, but they're also people. So yeah, very, very good, David. Thank you. So I'm going to start with looking at some different midrashim about some of these things. So this is going back on the original one of Ishmael and Yitzchak. And this is what Rashi says in source 4. So he says, from the fact that they both showed up, Rashi says, he's quoting the Midrash, from this we gather that Ishmael repented of his evil ways and yielded the precedence to Isaac. This is what is meant by the good old age, mentioned in connection with Avraham. So that's what I mentioned before, that this idea that Avraham died at a good old age is the fact that he died with both of his children being tzaddikim. They were both good, righteous people. And what's the indication that Ishmael was righteous? Not simply the fact that he was there, but the fact that it says Isaac and Ishmael. Ishmael is the eldest. But it says the fact that he allowed Yitzchak to, in a sense, go first showed that he recognized, the spiritual superiority of his younger brother. And that shows that the humility shows that he had become righteous, in his own right. It's strange Midrash, like why the fact that he lets Yitzchak go further, that means he repented, and what was Ishmael repenting from? What did Ishmael need to repent for? So there's earlier Midrashim that say that the reason that Sarah banished Ishmael was because he was sinning, because it says that he was laughing, and they discuss, well, what does it mean he was laughing? Was he idolatry, adultery? Like what that means. So there's this idea that Ishmael was no good, and that's why Sarah had him banished. She didn't want to be a bad influence on her son Yitzchak. And this is saying that ultimately he came around and repented and so forth. Okay. This midrash really just focuses on the moment, like the fact that, Yishmael's status. It's not looking at the relationship, right? It's not trying to think about the dynamic between the two. And so from this midrash, we don't really have any sense about the feeling of Ishmael and Yitzchak working together. What did the relationship look like afterwards? It's kind of left open. It's a bit more just kind of like a surprise that Ishmael's present, and they say, the fact that he's there and puts Yitzchak first must be that he's righteous. But I don't know, it doesn't really kind of go into the deeper kind of issues that I think we're thinking about. There's another midrash that I think does. It actually came across this in one of the writings of Rabbi Sachs, because he quoted this midrash. I thought it was really interesting. So he quotes this. This is in the midrash. And it says the following. This midrash is going on the fact that the episode of when Yitzchak and Rivka meet. So Eliezer has gone to the house of to the Avraham's family and has brought back Rivka. And we know that there's this encounter. Rivka comes back and they see Yitzchak at a distance, and she says, "Who is that?" And it says it's Yitzchak, and it says he covers her, and she comes off the camel, and then they come together, and it says that Yitzchak is finally consoled after the loss of his mother. It's a very interesting story. There's emotion there. It's also a bit strange. It's a whole story there, but it says that where was Yitzchak? It says that he had gone out to the field. So the Midrash is picking up on this kind of coming and going of Yitzchak. And it says the following. It says, where did Isaac go? It mentions that he went. So where did he go? So it says he went to Be'er Lachai Ro'i. Be'er Lachai Ro'i is what we saw earlier on, that it says that Yitzchak settled near Be'er Lachai Ro'i, meaning so after the death of his father, he went to Be'er Lachai Ro'i. So the Midrash is saying that already during the life of Avraham, he already had gone to Be'er Lachai Ro'i. That's where he was going. But the Midrash is like wondering, what is Be'er Lachai Ro'i? It's like a very strange name of a place. And they're saying that the name of the place is actually describing something. It's not an actual place by that name. It's describing something. So what's it describing? What's Be'er Lachai Ro'i? So it says he went to Be'er Lachai Ro'i. This is source 5. What does that mean? It says he went to bring Hagar, she who sat by the well, and called out to the life of the world, meaning to God, see my suffering. Right? So what is Be'er Lachai Ro'i? It means the well where she called out to the Ro'i, to the one who sees the world, as it were. And so in this description, what's happening over here? Why would Yitzchak have gone to Hagar? Why would he be bringing Hagar? Right, Hagar is Ishmael's mother. So why would Yitzchak be going to get Hagar? Anybody?
Yeah, to bring her back to her husband.
Good.
Her first husband.
Right. Well, why would he be doing that? Why would he be doing that now?
The mother's no longer living, and at a certain point, Avraham had loved Hagar, and so he's bringing her back to him.
Right, exactly, right. This is after the death of Sarah. So Yitzchak's mother has died, and according to the Midrash, he then goes and gets Hagar, who his own mother had banished, and brings her to Avraham because he feels he doesn't want his dad to be alone. He doesn't want his dad to be alone. So he goes out and he finds Hagar and he brings her back, which fits with another Midrash, because the Midrash, the Torah itself says that Avraham took another wife. Her name was Keturah. And one of the opinions of the Midrash is that that's Hagar, that he went back. So this is filling in and saying, that's Hagar. How did it happen? It wasn't that Avraham, followed up and said, oh my gosh, I missed you all these years, but that Yitzchak went and got her. So according to this, what kind of relationship do you think Ishmael and Yitzchak had? I would think a very positive one. I mean, if Yitzchak went and, got Ishmael's mother and brought her back to Avraham, you would think that Ishmael would be grateful. Look, Yitzchak, what a good guy. He didn't have to do that. He really cares. And, and then the fact that Ishmael is also at the burial makes sense. And even though all these decades later, and we say, well, where is he coming from? So the point is, his mother is with Avraham. So it's like not surprising that Ishmael would be in touch and know what's going on and ultimately be there, right? So if you take all of this through, you actually see there was this kind of reconciliation that ultimately took place between Hagar and Avraham, between perhaps Ishmael and Avraham, Ishmael and Yitzchak. And there's this whole other story that's not explicit in the Torah that's actually quite amazing if the Midrash is right about like all of these things that are actually taking place, and really kind of changes the whole dynamic. At the same time, I think there's still the basic question there of, so what happened to Yitzchak and Ishmael afterwards?
Rabbi, just a minute, please. Abraham and Hagar had more children, so it strikes me as a little bit odd, that those other children were not also at the Levoya.
Yeah, interesting. What we do know is it says that Abraham sends them away, right? If you assume Keturah is Hagar, which is not necessarily the case, we know that it says that he sends away those children. He gives them presents and they go away. So maybe that's why they're not there. But Ishmael is his firstborn, so maybe that's different. It's a good question, Dorothy. It's a good question. Sometimes we have better questions than answers. Yeah. So let's go on and just see what it says over here, because I want to look at one other verse with Esau and Yitzchak, and this is what it says in the Torah. So we're not even looking at the Midrash, right? So we know that after this encounter between Yaakov and Esau and the gifts and in the embrace, and the different opinions, was it an embrace? Was Esau actually trying to kill Yaakov? Whatever it is, take it as it were. It was an embrace, a reconciliation. We know that then Esau says, all right, so let's go. And Yaakov says, no, you go ahead, right? And the verse then says, in source number 6, it says, so Esau started back that day on his way to Seir, but Yaakov sojourned to Sukkot, right? So after that encounter, they don't actually then stick together. They kind of go their separate way. And yet at the time of Yitzchak, death, they come back together to bury him. But do they then part ways again? Was it just they showed up for the funeral? But then that was it, right? And so there's kind of all these ways to look at the fact that the children bury the parent together as, are they each just doing it as dutiful children to their parent? Or does it actually say anything about their relationship to each other? That's kind of the question, and it's not clear. And again, depending on the way you look at it, you could kind of see both things being the case. What we don't have is any clear indication from the Torah, because we don't see interactions between Yitzchak and Ishmael afterwards, and we don't see interactions between Esau and Yaakov afterwards. The only children that we see interactions with after the burial are between the brothers. It's a contentious one, but that's the only one where we know that there is something that happens afterwards. So let's look at what Ramban says when he looks at that story. Did Yaakov know? Didn't Yaakov know? Were they telling the truth? Were they lying? So Ramban has something interesting to say on this. Would anybody like to read the Ramban? Yeah, Eve, you want to go for it? If you don't mind.
Okay.
Thank you.
And they told him all the words of Joseph. It is my opinion, in line with the plain meaning of Scripture, that it was never told to Jacob throughout his entire lifetime that the brothers had sold Joseph. That's what we discussed before. Rather, he thought that Joseph had strayed in the field, and those who found him took him and sold him into Egypt. The brothers did not want to tell him of their sin, being afraid for their lives, lest he be wroth and curse them as he did to Reuben, Simeon, and Levi. Furthermore, while Joseph, in his good ethical conduct, did not want to tell him, it is for this reason that it is said, and they sent a message unto Joseph, saying, the father did command before he died, etc. And had Jacob known of this matter, it would have been proper for them to plead before their father at the time of his death, to command Joseph by word of his mouth, and he would have granted his father's request and not rebelled against his word. And they would not have been in danger, nor would they need to feign words out of their own hearts.
Okay, thanks, Eve. So according to Ramban, Yaakov didn't know. And in fact, if Yaakov had known, then they would have asked Yaakov to convey this message perhaps directly. And it's almost, they say it in the name of their father, perhaps almost as just like a stylistic thing, like as almost as a way of saying, please forgive us, right? It's like, they don't mean literally, he told us to tell you. It's like their way of saying, our father would not want you, to take repercussion against us, unless perhaps they assumed that maybe Yosef. In any case, according to Ramban, Yaakov never knew. The brothers didn't tell him. Yosef.
So this is their way of apologizing.
Maybe, yeah. Or maybe they thought that Yosef didn't know whether he knew or didn't know. It's unclear, but it's interesting to say that at least in Ramban's view, Yaakov actually never knew. He never knew, and he made assumptions about what happened, and was left at that. Yosef never said anything to his father. He didn't want to upset him, and just kind of, and that was basically it. What's interesting is, if you were to ask, how are we known as Jewish people in the Torah? How do you refer to the Jewish nation?
Ivri.
Well, Ivri is the Hebrew, right? Going back further, but normally, right? What's the name of the state? What do we call?
Yisrael.
Yisrael, Bnei Yisrael. So why are we called Bnei Yisrael, the sons of Yisrael? Yisrael is Jacob. Why are we called Bnei Yisrael? Why are we not called Bnei Avraham? It's not a trick question. Anybody? Why are we not called Bnei Avraham, the children of Abraham? Why are we called Bnei Yisrael?
Wasn't it at the time that he struggled with the angel? And
that's why he's called Yisrael. But I'm saying, why are we called Bnei Yisrael? Why are we called the children of Israel and not the children of Abraham?
Because we are unified. We are all the children of this.
Right. We're not all the
Yaakov.
children of Abraham are part of our nation. Half of them aren't. Right? We're not all the children of Isaac. Some of Isaac's children are not part of the nation, but all of Yisrael's children are part of the nation, right? That's why we're referred to as the children of Yisrael, the children of Jacob, right? And so there's this sense, right, that when it came to Jacob, all of his children, shall we say, stayed together. They had a fight, there was contention, but ultimately they stick together. And perhaps when it comes to Ishmael and Yitzchak, maybe there's reconciliation, maybe there's not, but ultimately they're two different nations. Same thing with Yaakov and Esau. But ultimately with Yisrael, they stick it out together. Now, we could kind of get into broader, theologies of nationhood and identity with this, but that's not really what I'm interested in right now. What I'm interested in pulling out from this is to say that different things happen in different families after the death of a parent, right? And sometimes it's reconciliation and sometimes it's division. And there's a book that's interesting, written by Rabbi Mark Angel, who was the rabbi for many years of the Spanish and Portuguese synagogue in New York, called The Orphaned Adult, where he talks about adults who lose their parents, right? So even as adults, people become orphans, as it were, even though we think of orphans as children. And so he kind of wrote a book to talk about what is the experience of adults when they lose their parents. And he wrote the following, and I just pulled out one selection from this. He said the following, this is in source number 8. He says, once both parents are dead, it becomes somewhat more difficult for the siblings and their families to get together. Very often, the parents were the unifying forces in the family structure. Unless the siblings really like each other, their contacts may subside with the passing of years. They become matriarchs and patriarchs of their own families, and their family tends to be vertical towards their children and grandchildren rather than horizontal towards their siblings. Unmarried children will find themselves more and more on their own without strong family connections. And so he describes here this difficult reality, right? That oftentimes, you kind of have the sense of the matriarch and patriarch, and, everyone kind of comes together under them. But once the matriarch or patriarch have died, well, then each of those lower ones basically become the matriarchs and patriarchs of their own families and descendants. And they don't necessarily continue to stick with each other. And you kind of have these new shoots that essentially begin. And he says it doesn't have to happen. Sometimes you have siblings who are super close, and even once, shall we say, that point of connection is no longer in this world, they still all get together and all the cousins get together, and it's, a growing, ever-growing family. But he recognized the fact that that's not always what happens, or over time that happens less and less once those point of connections are lost. And that's kind of like a painful thing to think about on some level. On the other hand, it's also kind of what happens very often. And I think these stories kind of bring that reality to light. The fact that some families after the death of a parent don't stick together, and some families continue to stick together. And there is a situation where sometimes even feuding family members need to come together for the point of a funeral, and that can be quite contentious. But that doesn't necessarily mean that after the funeral they're going to continue to work together. It's kind of they deal with their family estate, and then they move on. And I think, my point in studying these episodes is not to necessarily, give a lesson like, this is what Judaism says is what should happen, but more to really just show that Torah is showing us the reality of family dynamics and the fact that things can go in different ways. Obviously, we say in the perfect world, you have the Bnei Yisrael example where families work things out and find a way to kind of become a larger growing family. But equally, that doesn't always happen. And I think for me, and this is the point I think I'll make from what I kind of started with, is that it has a lot to do with, intentionality, and whether, in the sense that if things just happen, they happen. But if somebody doesn't want things to be a particular way, sometimes you can't just assume it will happen. You have to be proactive, right? So if siblings want to remain part of a bigger family, not just kind of start their own line, well, then you have to be proactive to ensure that those relationships are maintained and that the cousins and the second cousins and so forth have relationships, because as people live in different places and there's different dynamics and perhaps different, ideologies in the family, right? Things can kind of start to splinter. And I'm not even necessarily saying whether that's a good or a bad thing. I think in a perfect world, it's not what we want to happen. But the point is, if one doesn't want that to happen, I think one has to be conscious about those things. And I think that's more what I kind of want to take out from this class, is to say that these are the kinds of things perhaps the Torah wants us to be thinking about. It's giving us different examples so that we are aware that things can play out in different ways, and we don't just find ourselves reacting in life, but actually being conscious of it through the examples of our different patriarchs and what happened, so that we can kind of then in our own lives kind of think about, do we want to be, Ishmael's and Yitzchak's, or do we want to be, Joseph's and the brothers? And again, it takes two to tango. It's not always up to one part of the family to decide that, but it's the kind of thing that one probably needs to do intentionally if they want it to happen a particular way. Does anyone have any kind of final thoughts they want to add before we close? Any thoughts or anything?
Well, you do have to work at relationships if you want to maintain, those family ties.
Yeah, I think that's true. You can't take relationships for granted. Even people who have good relationships, if you don't talk, then you don't have a relationship. So I think that's definitely true, and that's a lesson I think we all take from my own life. Everyone has to, be aware of that point. Okay, I think this is where we're going to stop. The next class, next week, we're going to look at the episode of Abraham's eulogy for Sarah. And in that context, we'll talk about spouses and the loss of a spouse in that context. Thank you all for coming tonight. Wish everybody well.
Thank you.
Many years, everyone. Take care. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.